Today is President's Day, of course. It's a day that some states originally used to honor America's first president, George Washington, and our 16th president, Abraham Lincoln, both of whom were born in February and both of whom are frequently ranked as two of our greatest presidents. And being a great president has a lot of components. It's about the tone that they set for the country. It's about projecting American leadership around the world. Most importantly, however, it's about the decisions. It's the decisions that presidents make that make a great president. And in a year when we are once again picking a president, and when choosing a Democratic candidate for president is what we are thinking about, one of the ways to judge a president is by the very first decision that they make, namely who they name as their running mate. That's one of those decisions that doesn't really seem to matter very much until it really, really matters. Which brings us to Mr. Lincoln. His first vice president was a guy named Hannibal Hamlin, the former governor of Maine. Hamlin was a radical Republican, which, unlike today, meant that he was really, really anti-slavery, not anti-science, not against making Republican presidents listen to congressional subpoenas or obey the law. In fact, Hamlin was so hardcore that he not only wanted to just emancipate enslaved African Americans, he wanted to arm them for the Civil War. But Lincoln, who made some great decisions in his 6 years as president, made one really, really bad one. He dropped Hannibal Hamlin as his vice presidential running mate when he ran for re-election in 1864. And instead, he chose this guy, Andrew Johnson, the Tennessee senator and former governor who was pro-union but very much anti-racial equality. Lincoln swapped him in as VP to help himself with Southern voters. And then he was assassinated a year after the election. And then Andrew Johnson became the president. And he proceeded to defy the radical Republican Congress, who were trying to vindicate the 600,000 plus deaths in the Civil War, not to mention Lincoln's death, by doing things like passing the first Civil Rights Act of 1866, which President Johnson vetoed. The Congress also passed a law saying the president could not fire the Secretary of War, who was in charge of the Union troops who were occupying the South to protect the formerly enslaved. Andrew Johnson promptly fired him anyway and got impeached. And it's hard not to wonder on this President's Day how different American history might have played out if Lincoln had not made what turned out to be the worst decision of his presidency and Hannibal Hamlin had become the 17th president instead of Andrew Johnson. And when we come back, the daunting choice the Democratic primary electorate is facing in trying to defeat Donald Trump.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.